Hi, my name is Angela Chavez, the Communications Director at Courage, California, and you're listening to Courage, It Looks Good on You. It's officially September and we're days away from the start of fall, and I cannot wait to bust out my big comfy sweaters and combat boots. Or so I hope, because I'm currently recording during a vicious heat wave that is not just affecting our beautiful state of California, but the western US in its entirety is breaking temperature records, and it's only going to become more extreme as climate change worsens. So, what are our leaders doing to help us mitigate climate change and help our communities adapt and thrive? Well, I'll tell you what they're not doing. In this episode of Courage, It Looks Good on You, we'll be speaking with organizers who have participated in advocacy work around climate justice and learn about the unfortunate fall of AB 2419, known as California Justice Act, which would have invested 40% of federal climate and infrastructure funding into low-income, indigenous, and rural communities and communities of color. That's right, folks. Our legislative leaders had a chance to invest climate funding into California's historically neglected communities, but chose not to. Maybe it's 110-degree temperature outside, but I'm feeling pretty heated. And I'm staying tuned in for this episode, and I hope you will too, because I really do want to understand what happened to Justice40 and why it didn't pass, and what I can do to ensure our communities have representation and are taken care of. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our presence on the traditional and unceded territory of hundreds of First Nations who are the traditional caretakers of the land that we call California.
Thank you, Angela. Hello, everyone. My name is LisaMarie. I'm the Development and Member Engagement Manager, and today we're talking about Justice40. I'm excited to be joined by Mike Young from California EnviroVoters and our very own Mai Do from Courage California and UC Riverside for this conversation. Hi, Mike and Mai. Thanks for joining us. Can you take a moment to introduce yourselves and your work for our listeners? Mai, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mai. I am the Policy and Partnerships Lead for Courage California. I'm also a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at UC Riverside. And I'm glad to be here.
And hi, I'm Mike Young. I'm the Political and Organizing Director for California Environmental Voters. Formerly, we were named the California League of Conservation Voters. Been here for over a decade. Really enjoy the partnership here with Courage, now Courage California, formerly Courage Campaign. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Mike, and likewise. All right, let's get started. California is considered a national leader on climate change. Like, for example, how our higher standards for vehicles have pushed the car industry to move faster on addressing climate change. Do you think that California still earns that reputation? Mike, let's start with you.
So I would say California regained that reputation. The reality was, before this year, the last really major piece of climate legislation that passed out of California passed in 2018. It was the last governor. We had a change in the pro tempship. Actually, last year, we ran a campaign at EnviroVoters talking about how the Senate became a place where environmental bills went to die. And it was a big reason why a lot of climate legislation was struggling in California in general. And when our leaders went to Glasgow last year, where the United Nations conference was, there was a lot of talk about California being the leader. And I think Speaker Rendon said it best when he's like, talking to all these leaders, I realized California has just really fallen behind in our leadership. And it was particularly ironic because you had somebody like then Majority Leader Bob Hertzberg, who's part of the Senate coalition, representing California there in Glasgow. Yeah, he's one of the key people who's killed climate bills left and right. And it just really said so much about the fact that California had really fallen away from what had once been something we were so proud of, which is our climate leadership. That said, we had a recent Public Policy Institute of California poll showing that the majority of Californians by far wish to see California continuing to be an international leader. And I think what happened with the end of the session with the governor's $54 billion climate budget, with the giant package of climate bills that advocates have been pushing for quite some time, that really came to the forefront, not the least of which was oil setbacks to ensure that communities were actually pretty far away from oil rigs. A lot of big successes have changed the direction of California. And there were some fights, to your point, about where is California's leadership on clean cars. During the Trump administration, there was a lot of struggling between what car companies were going to do, as we saw car companies like Toyota backtrack and where the pledges that they had made and clean vehicles. And California's leadership in the regulatory space, especially the California Air Resources Board, really held the line to making sure that our cars continued to be efficient. They continued to push the standards there. And when a lot of companies were trying to backtrack and walk away because the Trump administration had been in charge, we saw California work with a lot of great companies like Honda to push back and say, no, we are going to keep these standards. We're going to change the timeline of when we deliver some of those things, but we need to continue to move forward, not backwards. So in terms of cars, I think California's leadership has continued to be the case. But it was only until the last few months, California had gone backwards on climate. But now I think it's safe to say we're back on track.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. And I think, I think for a long time we sort of had made a lot of progress, and not just in when it comes to environmentalism, right, and fight against climate change, but generally speaking, right, I think we found ourselves in a place almost of broad, perhaps like complacency, right, or sort of this patting ourselves on the back for making these certain accomplishments, right, during like the 2000s, like the late 90s, and then sort of stagnating for a while. And then because we stagnated, right, for so long up until recently, that meant that we had fallen behind. And that's not just, like I said, that's not just on climate, but also across other issue areas, right? Thinking about economic equity and all of that. So really, I think now, especially just given all of what's going on when it comes to like the fires and air pollution and all of the crises that our communities face, it's really a good time for us to really dig in and make sure that we are catching up and making up for all that time that we sort of just stagnated there.
Thank you for both of those answers. As we know, we're seeing a climate bill package just got passed in the state legislature. By this podcast, we're hoping Governor Newsom will sign it into law. Could you explain to our listeners what's in this package? Does it meet the moment we're in right now? Let's start with you, Mai.
Yeah, so one of the things that Mike mentioned, right, was the setbacks bill, which is huge. I know that when I had seen it come across, when I had seen that it passed, right, that had taken over my Twitter feed, right? Everyone from environmental justice leaders, right, to folks who have been working sort of just broadly, right, on economic development, like basically everyone across issue areas, right, was applauding that this had passed. And so that was something that I think is just a huge piece that people have been fighting for years. Like I saw people had posted photos of themselves rallying for setbacks from like 10 years ago, right? And they were like, look, I was holding this sign like 10 years ago and here we are now, right? And so that's just one of the things that I think really stands out, right? As like a huge landmark from this legislative session, even if we've had some other bills die.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that this meets the moment. And I picked those words carefully. This meets the moment right now, where California decided that after the passage of the Inflation Reductions Act, California was like, you know what? We have to go further. The national IRA is a really huge piece of legislation. It's unprecedented, and if successful and continues with the trajectory that we hope it does, it will accomplish about 80% of what the United States need to accomplish for the Paris Agreement. But there's still the other 20% to go. It has to be leadership from other places, like big states like California, right? So our leadership was just as important because we need to continue to keep pushing. So with this climate package, we passed setbacks, which is fantastic. We passed a bill to codify carbon neutrality by 2045. We passed the bills to establish better interim target goals to get to 100% renewable energy. We created a framework on what it looks like to work with carbon capture and storage, which we've been working on very carefully. But a lot of the key reforms that we wanted in it ultimately did make it through, like banning the use of enhanced oil recovery in carbon capture and storage, which is a short version for people who aren't familiar with it, is people use carbon to basically extract from more oil rather than actually using it to reduce carbon. But we did pass a lot of these really key bills, and it wasn't everything. We didn't accelerate our climate targets, right? AB 2133 by Bill Quirk didn't make it through, and we were disappointed to see that SB 260, our sponsored bill to hold corporations accountable for all of their missions and become more transparent on where they are polluting. That failed in the legislature as well. But collectively, California made some really significant moves to put us right in the moment. But again, the reason I say I pick those words very carefully is because it meets the moment. It doesn't meet the next one, right? And when we think about something like the climate, we look at this as the hottest summer we've ever had, but I'm often reminded, and and encourage people to remember, that this is best looked at as the coolest summer we're likely to have in our lifetimes, which means complacency in saying we have done enough is actually going to hurt us. And so California has caught up, right? After 4 years of basically being MIA on the world stage, it is now caught up and pushing forward and saying, yes, we are here to regain our climate leadership. But that is enough for today. It is not enough to solve all of our problems. We have not solved the crisis by any stretch of the imagination, but we should be proud of what we've done, and we should remember that big things can happen, and they will happen with the right political will, and we can continue to do so moving forward, so that we actually can not just meet this moment, but we can meet future moments as they come.
Thank you for that. Just to kind of follow up on the role of California and the influential presence it has in the nation and in the world, why do you think that is? What do you see as the future of environmental and climate activism? Mike?
So it starts with the fact that we are really not a state. We are a state by the United States' standards, but we are the fifth largest economy in the world. The influence of California can't be understated because we are just an enormous market, right? So what we do here has a huge impact in what other people do, other countries do. In the United Nations talks, California's presence and California's leadership matters because we are essentially seen as a big state. We're essentially a country that is doing big climate things. And to give you an idea of what that looks like, just recently, California's regulatory state decided to say, hey, look, we are going to stop the sale of internal combustion engines, of new internal combustion engines by 2035, right? And the day after that passed, you saw Washington and Massachusetts go, all right, we're in. Like, we're joining California, right? When the last measure passed, the original process was called Advanced Clean Cars. When the last version of it passed, you saw about 15 states follow California's lead right across the country, representing almost half the population of the United States. Basically, we're starting to see the same thing happen here, where when California does something, because we are just such a huge market share, because we're so influential on sheer size, other places just can't help but notice. And certainly it's also the case where if you're looking at the market, you're thinking about what can you do, you want the customer base of California. No company really wants to make a customer base just for California, like a product that's just for California's market and not for the rest of the world when we're such a large portion of the market. So when we make a change, it makes this more sense for companies to go, all right, we're just going to wholesale change when California does, because making two products doesn't make sense for us anymore. So when we do something big like that here, it just has such a profound impact in other places because of our sheer size.
That's basically about right. Of course, Mike says it way better than I ever could. It's really this question of like market share, right? And then also sort of as an extension of that, it makes us cultural leaders, right? That we have, when something passes in California, that it becomes that there is opportunities for culture shift because we have so many like cultural leaders, right? And we also think about things like arts, like the arts industry, right? Entertainment industry in California. We can't forget, right, that those creators, right, the people who really move and shift culture across the country, a lot of them call California their home, right? And so whenever we engage in whatever transformative, reforms and legislating, whenever we're able to do that, it really means that we're able to spread that not just from like sort of this like rational standpoint when it comes to moving things in the economy. It also means that people, I think, are really able to shift what that looks like on the day-to-day in terms of what people are wanting to do, right? What people think, is either like normal, or what people think is, for lack of a better word, right? Or just to really say as quickly, like what people think is cool.
I kind of want to take us, so we talked a bit about California's influence on the national level and how we have one of the fifth largest economies in the world. We've talked about how other states kind of follow suit at the national level, and I would like to get your thoughts on the Green New Deal. A few years ago, it seemed like such a radical idea, But over time, we've seen more and more people accept it as a goal. What progress have we made on a Green New Deal in California? And what more do we need to figure out to make it a reality? Maidi, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so I think one of the really amazing things that I've been able to witness right over the past few years is just the growth of the coalition of folks who are working to really bring forward right the Green New Deal as a broad transformative idea that is not just like an abstract idea, right, but actually like sort of more concrete proposals about how we can transform our lives. And kind of similarly to other transformative ideas when it comes to things like reforming or like addressing police brutality, right? Or thinking about issues of like gender equity and all of that. When it comes to the Green New Deal, I think really what has changed, I think, in California as well as the rest of the nation, I think, is a willingness to really like think creatively about what it is that we could possibly be doing, right? And I think especially I attribute this a lot to younger folks and a lot of the, I mean, but not just to distribute to younger folks, but definitely a lot of it does come, I think, from younger people who are at the forefront who are saying like, we have lived like this, but we do not have to live like this, right? We have lived under increasing threat of climate disaster, and we will continue to do so, but we don't have to continue to do so, right? And really just sticking in and refusing to accept the status quo as unmovable and being innovative in how we're thinking and allowing ourselves to just like, say, what if, right? And even if some proposals like, like you said, seemed like such a radical idea, even if it does, I think a lot of young people, especially, are kind of like, well, so what, right? You don't know if something works until you try it.
Yeah, I like the way that Maido phrased it, right? So even if something seems radical right now, why not? And it's funny because when you really look at the history of time and what is considered radical, that keeps changing very, very quickly, right? And when you're faced with the reality that we are faced with right now, well, it didn't used to be the case that you'd have these giant heat waves where Sacramento would get to 116 degrees, right? Where Death Valley wouldn't get to 127 degrees, where you're wondering that if a record drought is still a drought or if this is just the new normal. There's a moment where I think sometimes when we become just so complacent into the mentality of what we think the certain landscape is going to be that we miss the fact that people are seeing it in a different way. And I think the reason why young people are so engaged in climate, why climate's constantly their top or second issue, is because they don't live in a world where they've become complacent over something that used to be. They look at the world as it is and they see where's our future heading towards, right? We've done tons of polling. Some of it you can see through the PPIC, some of it you can see through our website on the Education Fund that really looks at how young people are looking at climate. And the short answer is they're worried about it because they don't think that today's world is going to stay the same. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And so it becomes less and less radical to think that we need a bigger and better response to a crisis that's getting worse. What's actually a problem, I think, is when we look at a situation and go, oh my God, the world's on fire, and we're going to try to put out this small piece of the fire, and then you're just completely ignoring the fact that the world is getting hotter and hotter, so the fires are getting worse, right? Everything requires a more appropriate response. And when I look at the Green New Deal, that's absolutely what the Green New Deal is designed to be. It's the appropriate response. It is meeting not just the moment, but the moments that we are in time and time again, but not just in terms of tackling greenhouse gas emissions, which your average person doesn't really recognize. They don't know what that is. That's not something that impacts them directly when in their conversation. They experience it through extreme heat. They experience it through drought. They experience it through, are we going to run out of energy in this grid right now? Right? Like, is our grid going to be stable when it gets too hot? Right? Like that's how they feel it in real time. And so what we're trying to do with the Green New Deal is helping people address the moment that we're in and as they change, but also doing so in an equitable way, because the reality is the way the environmental movement has been through its history has not been adequate, fair, or equitable, right? It has turned a blind eye to the communities that have needed the most. And that is honestly just outright unacceptable. We have to be better. We have to be different. And that's what the Green New Deal is really trying to do, and saying, no, everyone has a piece of this. It's not just, richer communities that get away with it. It's not just communities that are along the coast, right? It's everyone, inland communities, communities of color, communities that have historically been excluded from these conversations. They need to be part of the conversation. They need to be engaged, and they need the support too. And that's really the world that we're trying to build. And that's a policy that's, to me, not very radical at all. It's actually what we have always needed to do, but just turned a blind eye to.
Thank you both for uplifting the urgency of the moment that we're in and centering young folks. This is top of mind for young folks, and thank you too for reiterating that. As we know, one of the priority bills that Courage California was a proponent of was AB 2419, also known as the California Justice40 Act. And this would have ensured that 40% of federal funding coming to California for climate change and energy be dedicated to communities facing the most environmental burdens. Speaking to your point, Mike, low income, rural communities, and communities of color. And this bill did not pass. I'm wondering who tends to wield more power in DC and Sacramento and in local decisions about environmental justice? And how do we make sure that the communities impacted have a voice at decision-making tables? Mai, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this is actually my first year, I guess, like working the legislative session would be the best way to put it. But that being said, I think it's been really eye-opening to really see kind of what goes on the floor of the California state legislature and the Senate and the Assembly. Mike said, just like listening to how people, talk about bills like this, right, and talk about them in ways that are, essentially just like parroting talking points from the California Chamber of Commerce, right, from big business groups, from the fossil fuel industry, from agencies that maybe don't want to be told exactly how they should be spending their money, all of that, and hearing them talk about bills as job killers, right? That's the famous California Chamber of Commerce. They have a job killer list of bills that they deem to be air quote job killers, when really a lot of times those are really good bills that actually are advancing equity and justice in a lot of ways. And I think from the top to the bottom, we talk about sort of big interests having more decision-making influence. And I think that's true in a lot of ways. But I think also when I think about, for example, at the local level, right, it's on one hand, it is true that sort of the vocal affluent minority tends to be the most vocal people, right? They're the ones who show up to city council meetings. They're the ones who are able to, contribute $5,000 to whatever city council campaign and all of that. And so, of course, they're the ones who get contracts, who are able to influence local decision making on, let's say, permitting or zoning, right? But at the same time, I think there's also a lot of opportunities at the local level for movement, right, and for local organizers. And I think we've seen this amongst folks across from labor across to environmental justice organizers have been able to really organize against Amazon, for example, and really provide real reasons, right, tangible reasons, examples of people in these communities who are facing the environmental and economic impacts of warehouse expansions, and they've been able to slow and stop some of them, right? Of course, going up against giants like Amazon is no easy task. And so Amazon has managed to continue to creep over a lot of the warehousing and logistics industry across the state. But still, right, the fact that folks are still able to make that change, right, to actually stop some of these expansions, and to make city councils stop and say okay, well, maybe we should reevaluate this, right, I think really shows the capacity for making change, right? I kind of think of the phrase big fish, small pond, right? When the pond is small, right, you just got to have at least, even just one other person jumping in, right? Makes a huge difference there.
Yeah, thinking about your question, the good and bad news of the situation is that the system works the way that it was intended to. And that's both a good and a bad thing, right? And I guess it's good in that it works the way it was supposed to, but it's bad in that it was not designed to work the way that it really should. And by that, I mean, people who show up, that's 80% of the conversation. When people think about why does industry have the influence that it does, when you think about corporate polluters, people who represent things that we know we don't like, it's because they're there all the time. They have paid somebody to be in front of these legislators 24/7, right? They meet with them every day, if not every week, right? They meet with them in the halls. I meet them in their districts. They're all over the place. But your average person has other stuff and a whole another life, and they don't get paid to be a lobbyist, right? They're not there to talk to the legislator all the time. And so that you have these people who are paid there who are shaping the view of the decision makers all the time. Now, the good news is that in Sacramento, the influence there that people can have can be really great when people step up. Big bills pass out of California because state legislators are a little bit more in touch with their districts, and a few phone calls, a few interactions in district, especially a few visits when people can actually make it up to Sacramento and meet legislators where they're at, can have a really huge influence. It's not quite as powerful in DC, where incumbency has been very long lasting for a lot of these folks, right? They've been there for a very long time. Most of the decisions are ultimately made by people like the speaker and the pro tem and the president, and the minority leaders, right? A lot of decisions are backdoor deals. But in the state legislature, that influence that people can have to move policy is huge when we're able to step up. And we've seen it time and time again, this year being one of them, where people were heavily engaged in a lot of the climate work. But the problem is that it cannot be a one-time deal. And I say that in a negative sense because people, again, have busy lives. They have other things that they're doing, and we totally understand that. And that makes it really tough for you to engage in everything that's happening all the time. But that's what industry counts on, right? They are paid to be there all the time, and they know you are not. And so they get that undue influence because they're showing up when you can't show up. And the extent to which we have to do something about it means that we, as a people, have to keep showing up for the public, for the community good, time and time again, keep fighting the good fight. And there are a lot of us, California, I should say, with California environmental voters who have staff here all the time fighting for you. But at the same time, the industry has an army of lobbyists. They completely outnumber us, and so we need people's support to engage whenever you can. That's an unfair burden in a lot of sense to put onto people. I get that, but it's also how the process works. And until we change the system, that will continue to be a really huge player and a huge impact or decision maker in who influences what, because legislators are very reactive and they react to the people that they talk to the most.
Thank you for that answer, both Mike and Mai. I love that you both keyed in on communities showing up and some of the barriers to folks having their voices heard. And I also like that you uplifted that folks like us are trying to fight on behalf of the people in these spaces. And for me, I'm curious, how do you see activists and progressives evolving their response to engage more folks and to truly hold these industries accountable? Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that we can do this. So the first is meeting legislators and meeting with communities more regularly, right? If you can't always go to Sacramento, we should be demanding more from our legislators. I know a lot of times we expect their legislators and take them for granted and assume, oh, they're doing pretty well. But if they don't hear from you, they might not be doing as well as you think. This session, we've seen, for instance, somebody who, like Cotty Petrie-Norris, who's in a swing district in coastal California, who by all measures should be a much stronger environmental legislator. And she was actually working behind the scenes against the setbacks bill, right? And she's counting on the fact that people didn't know that. Here's somebody who had an oil spill in her district earlier this year, right? And she was working against something that would protect communities from oil. It was just completely unacceptable, right? And it was something that we knew was happening. We called her out on it, but we need more of her constituents to call her out on it, because she is counting on the fact that people didn't notice that, because industry was beating her and pushing her on, like, oh, this is bad for business, this is bad for oil, yada, yada, yada. She's hearing from them and not hearing enough from us that, no, this is something that's good. And like, you actually should be a champion on this issue, right? This is the type of thing that happens. So a big part of it is, for us, we need to do better about regularly engaging with people, meeting people where they're at in their communities, in their neighborhoods, having more town halls, telling people about what are the key bills that they need, and helping them as simple as possible to connect with their legislators, so the legislators do know that they care about these issues. And I think we should be doing more things where I would love to see more programs where we're actually helping people get to Sacramento and talking to them before the bills are written, right? I think a lot of times we're responding to, here's a bill issue, come support this bill or ask your member to oppose this bill. But what if we can get people up there ahead of time so that legislators are listening to the constituents saying, this is what I care about. This is the bill you need to champion for us, right? They do that when bills can still be written at the beginning of the year. And then all of a sudden the legislators thinking, this is what my community has asked me to do. So they've started off with a framework of, this is my community's priority. I think we are sometimes reactive in terms of how we organize our folks too. And to the extent that we can get ahead of that, to the extent that we can talk to our different communities about what we need and make sure that the voices that historically have been excluded are included in this conversation, I think that'll go a really, really long way in changing the way that our legislators even view themselves, let alone the legislation that they have to author.
Co-governance, I think, right, is really key. And also for, amongst movement, I think, Mike, your comment about sort of working right with community and really ensuring that we're engaged in community, I think is really big. One of the most difficult things I think I've been sort of witnessing in this role and just generally over the years has been seeing sort of like, whether it's artificial or organic or like, how severe the issue is in some, when it comes to particular issues, sort of seeing like splits right across different, different issue area, people who work in different issue areas, right? People who maybe work with more specific aspects of issue areas versus others, when really I think coalition building, right, from larger organizations down to community-based organizations and individual organizers is huge. And I think that's how we see some of the, like you said, like some of the really big wins that we've achieved, but being able to do that more, right, and really being conscious of like, how we're engaging the people on the ground who are already doing this work every day, who are already talking to people, workers, students, like seniors in our communities, is really key, right? Especially for those of us who do work at like the statewide level and like even at the regional level, right? We're not necessarily the ones who are doing like service providing, right? And I think sometimes the people who are working at nonprofit organizations who do service providing, like those folks sometimes get like lost in the conversation, whether it is about environmental justice or whether it is about like housing or addressing like trying to advance racial justice, right? All of these things. I think oftentimes, those orgs and those organizers and people often get lost in the conversation, and it's really up to us who are already sort of thinking, right? Hopefully we're conscious of that, to just sort of make sure that we're really putting that top of mind every day.
I have a few more questions as they relate to what's on the ballot this year in California. One is Prop 30. So I'm curious, kind of like building off this conversation, how is equity built into Prop 30? And what do you say to some of the people critiquing this ballot proposition as funded by and benefiting Lyft? Maido, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I will say I think Mike maybe has a better or like a little bit more well thought out response to this, but I will say one of the things that is really critical in Prop 30 to me is that it prioritizes taxing the wealthiest Californians, right, in order to pay for things like wildfire prevention and wildfire fighting, and also the electric vehicle like infrastructure and expanding access to electric vehicles. I know myself, currently like access to electric vehicle is really not something that I have. So it's something that I've been thinking of, just given like my partner does not have a vehicle, for example, and like we do not exactly live very close to robust public transit infrastructure. So all that stuff, right? It's really close, really top of mind for me right now. And so I think, just making sure that folks who are quite comfortable are paying their fair share, right, to ensuring that everyone has access to electric vehicles and that everyone is able to actually like breathe less polluted air, I think is something that just the main reason why I'm doing this work in terms of supporting Prop 30. I grew up in a city with the nation's largest landfill by volume. I don't know if that's actually still the title that it enjoys, but I grew up with a pretty terrible air quality, and this was even in like a more affluent, I guess, neighborhood in Santa Clarita. So, everyone from people who live in Santa Clarita, right, realtors in Santa Clarita, to folks who live, down in like Thai Town in LA, right? Everyone should be able to not have to deal with the pollution that we do, and making sure that the wealthiest Californians are paying, their fair share to make sure that happens, I think is a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, I would say first to the question of how does this helping communities that have historically been excluded. So I'd start off with noting that the federal government passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and we passed this giant climate bill, $54 billion in climate investments, right? And nowhere in the money that we're talking about is it guaranteed to necessarily go to every community proportionately that have been historically excluded. Prop 30 is actually different because it's explicitly written into the language of this initiative. Yes, 40% of those funds have to go to the communities that have been historically excluded, right? It's one of the few propositions that actually makes it clear who we are trying to help. So I would say one thing that's like, we've had these big things, but the Biden administration has an executive order to implement something like Justice40 to ensure that there's more equity. But it's only an executive order. It's not written into law. If Biden stops being president, right? If we just need a transition change in the presidency, and that could go away in an instant. And again, there's nothing really that locks people into a lot of these other investments, but this one does. And then, of course, we saw that Justice40 as the bill didn't pass. So even California itself is not saying, yes, we're going to guarantee this, but this initiative does, right? So it's been interesting because, a lot of people talk about why is this so important? And it's like, well, because this one actually is aiming towards communities that really need that. Now it's interesting because the opposition loves to say, and I'm really glad you brought this up. They love to say, "Oh, this is just a carve out for some industry like Lyft, who's like funding this, right?" And I'm insulted by it in several different ways. One, it's no question that Lyft is funding the initiative, but Lyft didn't write the initiative, right? Like this is to me a view of polluter pays. Corporations have basically created the problems that we are dealing with in our society. And if we said that we didn't want any money from any corporation, even for a policy that is actually good and would help our state, help our community, we're basically saying that it's going to be taxpayers who will always fund the bill. They'll fix up their mess. And that to me is ridiculous. But here's actually a corporation that decided, yeah, we're going to put in for this electric vehicle infrastructure. Now, the critique has been, oh, because they benefit from it. Yeah, and they do. You know who else benefits from electric vehicle infrastructure? Every Californian in California, right? It is the government's role to establish something like infrastructure to make sure that we actually have a system that gets us there. We just passed a motion so that we're going to get rid of internal combustion engines by 2035. But how are we going to do that if nobody can charge their vehicles anywhere, right? Like what's the point of having these vehicles if you don't have the places that it takes to charge them up? No one's going to want to buy that. And it's absolutely government's role to make sure that that happens. And much to Mai's point, the group that's funding this is ultimately billionaires, right? We're not even talking about 1% of Californians. The only people that this taxes is the 35,000 Californians who make over $2 million a year, right? This is like I think it's the 2% of the 1% right, of Californians. And at a time when the number of billionaires since the last time we had a tax directed towards them, which is ironically also number Prop 30. The last time that happened, they've more than doubled the sheer number of billionaires there are, right? So this is a group that can afford a little bit more. The tax is 1.75%, which is less than how much they got from the Trump tax scam. So they can afford this piece, but then investments will benefit everybody. And so when people are looking at this measure, I hope they recognize that this measure is the type of thing that we look for. It's a progressive tax. It's something that is designed for communities, especially communities that have been historically excluded. And it's an important piece of infrastructure to tackle climate and wildfire prevention, especially extreme wildfire prevention. And at a time when we ask, are we meeting the moment, right? Well, to everyone, I would say the federal government met the moment by passing the Inflation Reduction Act. The state government met the moment by passing a giant climate bill, along with a giant package of climate. And here, when people sometimes say, what can I do against climate? What can I do to tackle this problem? We have a ballot initiative that lets you do just that. So vote yes, because here's now our opportunity to do so as citizens who are not elected officials.
My next question is specific to the November election. We talked about Prop 30 being on the ballot. Is there any other landmark pieces of legislation or movers and shakers that y'all want to uplift for listeners that they might not that might not already be on their radar? Maidi, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I know Courage California, we've endorsed a lot of folks. I personally, out of those, the candidate that is running for Assembly District 40, Pilar Chavo, hopefully she will be the one representing Assembly District 40. And so, yeah, I know she's endorsed by Courage, and she's also comes from Labor, is not a anti-choice climate change denier like the incumbent. So just wanted to, just uplift her and all the great work that she's doing, not just like as a candidate, but generally in the community. She's done a lot of grassroots organizing and the community service work too around the area. Yeah.
I'd like to uplift SB 260. It was our sponsored bill that fell 1 vote shy in the Assembly past year. But it would basically require corporations that make $1 billion or more to disclose all of their carbon emissions throughout their entire supply chain. So even corporations that might be trying to hide how much they're polluting across the country by saying, oh, we're not going to pollute in California, we're just going to move it to Ohio. This required them to disclose that too, which is a real game changer. And the fact that the chamber fought so hard to kill this bill says to me that they have a ton to hide, that they really don't want us to know this. And I think when we finally pass this, I think it's going to be the case where we're going to be mind blown at just how much we discovered that they've secretly been doing that they really didn't want us to do. But I'd also want to thank some of the many, many champions. I mean, they're just too many to count. But a couple that just come off the top of my head, especially when it comes to justice, are Senators Monique Limon and Lena Gonzalez and Assemblymember Isaac Bryan. 3 of them were really the champions behind the Setbacks Bill 1137. These are 3 stalwarts who really fought for communities. Assemblymember Bryan authored the Justice40 bill as well this year. But these are people who really understand what it means to be working on behalf of community. And when we think about people who go to get put through the ringer but are still fighting for our communities, those are 3 names where I hope everybody who lives in their districts can recognize and appreciate what utter champions and stalwarts they are for communities, even in the face of insane oil industry opposition and attacks against them, often personal and just complete outright propaganda lies. But they have stood the test of time, they accomplished big things, and we wouldn't be here without their leadership.
Yeah, just a really quick, and speaking of bills too, yeah, and like folks like Senator Gonzalez, I wanted to shout out SB 1173, which died, but it would have required our 2 main retirement systems to divest $9 billion from fossil fuel production. And I know that the organizers who were working on that bill, it's coming back next year, hopefully, and I am really excited to see that pass. Yeah, because like Mike said, folks like Senator Gonzalez have been under attack from the fossil industry and from other bad actors for a really long time, and continue to be under attack from these bad actors, and yet they're still, willing and proud to carry some of these really important bills.
Thank you both, Mai and Mike. I really appreciate all the work that you both do in Sacramento, in your local communities. Thank you for uplifting the folks that you believe in and the champions that you want to see continue shaping climate change policy in California. I also want to uplift to listeners that you can access the California Environmental Voters Endorsements List and Voter Guide on their website. And the Courage California Voter Guide will be available for you to take a look at also to learn more about who's on your ballot this year and how you can impact change and climate change legislation in California.
And now, for your shot of courage. The 2022 California legislative session has ended, and our state legislature passed 15 of Courage California's priority bills. And now we look to Governor Newsom to sign bold and impactful legislation that will help advance our goals of equity, justice, and accountability. Visit couragecalifornia.org to view a full list of our priority legislation and the status of each bill, including the important legislation that our elected officials failed to pass. Bills that would have eliminated indentured servitude, divested state retirement funds from the fossil fuel industry, and stopped non-citizens from being transferred to immigration authorities after serving their prison and jail sentences. Now, who's ready for another election? I know I am. California's general election is on November 8th, and I'd like to personally invite you to vote. Yes, you. I want to hear your voice and your values be represented at the ballot box. Californians should start receiving their vote-by-mail ballots after October 10th. Your general election ballot will include 7 ballot propositions. Courage California has taken a position on the following ballot measures: yes on Prop 1, yes on Prop 28, yes on Prop 29, yes on Prop 30, and yes on Prop 31. To hear more about these ballot measures, listen to Episode 7's Shot of Courage, and keep an eye out for our statewide multi-issue voter guide, which will provide additional ballot recommendations, including candidate endorsements. Our California voter guide will be released in a matter of days. To make sure you don't miss it, sign up for our newsletter at couragecalifornia.org. And a friendly reminder that the last day to register to vote is October 24th. Visit couragecaliforniainstitute.org for voter registration resources, and be sure to tell a friend. I'm your host, Angela Chavez, and this has been Courage, It Looks Good on You. We hope you tune in next time, California, because with the general election and the Supreme Court returning in the fall, we're just getting started. And be sure to keep a lookout for our upcoming voter guide. If you liked this podcast, please rate it and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. And of course, share. With you, fashioned in courage, we can create a California that represents and serves us all. Let us know your thoughts about this episode by tagging us at CourageCA and using the hashtag CourageLooksGoodOnYou.